The maintenance hangar at Elmendorf Air Force Base fell silent as Captain Vera Ghost Kozlova walked past the gleaming F-22 Raptors. Her boots echoed against concrete stained with decades of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel, each step measured and precise. The younger airmen barely glanced up from their work, their eyes dismissive as they took in her slight frame and the administrative wings pinned to her flight suit. To them, she was just another desk jockey playing dress-up in pilot gear. What they didn't know was that the woman adjusting her headset had once vanished an entire enemy squadron over the Black Sea without a single radar signature appearing on anyone's screen. The classified after-action reports still bore her call sign in redacted ink, but those files were buried deeper than the Mariana Trench. Ghost had earned her name not through some Hollywood moment of bravado, but through something far more unsettling: her ability to make enemy aircraft simply disappear from existence, leaving only empty sky and unanswered radio calls. The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-flight chatter until Colonel Martinez stepped to the podium, his expression grave. "Gentlemen, we have a developing situation in the Aleutian Islands. Russian Bear bombers are conducting what they're calling routine navigation exercises approximately 200 miles off our coastline. Intelligence suggests this might be more than posturing." Lieutenant Commander Jake "Reaper" Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his swagger evident even while seated. "How many Raptors are we putting up, sir?" The question carried the assumption that he'd be leading the intercept mission. After all, he had the most flight hours among the active pilots, and his kill ratios from the Syrian conflict were impressive enough to warrant respect. "4 aircraft," Martinez replied, his eyes scanning the room before settling on an unexpected face. "Captain Kozlova will be leading the formation." The silence that followed wasn't the respectful quiet of professional acknowledgement. It was the awkward hush of disbelief. Reaper's eyebrows shot up, and several pilots exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Ghost remained perfectly still, her pale green eyes fixed on the mission parameters displayed on the briefing screen. She'd been flying transport missions and training exercises for the past 18 months, relegated to the aviation equivalent of middle management after what the brass euphemistically called operational reassignment. Martinez continued as if he hadn't noticed the tension. "Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We're looking at severe turbulence, low visibility, and the possibility of icing conditions above 20,000 feet. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood that this wouldn't be a routine intercept mission. The morning light filtering through the hangar windows caught the polished surfaces of the Raptor fleet, each aircraft representing 40 years of aerospace engineering evolution. But as Ghost studied the mission brief, she knew that all the technology in the world meant nothing if the person in the cockpit couldn't think 3 moves ahead of an adversary who had been planning this encounter for months. Captain Vera Kozlova had been flying F-22s when most of these pilots were still trying to figure out which end of a training aircraft pointed forward. Born in a small mining town in Montana to parents who had emigrated from Ukraine in the 1980s, she'd learned to fly in crop dusters before she was old enough to legally drive a car. Her father, Dmitry, had been a MiG pilot before the fall of the Soviet Union, and he'd passed down not just flying techniques, but an understanding of how Russian pilots thought, how they moved, how they breathed. The Air Force Academy had tried to break her down in the traditional ways: harsh discipline, impossible standards, and instructors who seemed personally offended by her quiet competence. Instead of cracking, Ghost had simply absorbed everything they threw at her and asked for more. Her academic performance was flawless, but it was in the cockpit where she truly distinguished herself. While other cadets struggled with the complex avionics and flight systems, Ghost moved through pre-flight checks like a pianist playing a familiar sonata. Her first assignment had been to the 94th Fighter Squadron at Langley, where she'd spent 2 years proving that her academy performance wasn't a fluke. The F-22 became an extension of her nervous system, responding to her inputs with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. But it was during her deployment to Eastern Europe that Captain Kozlova had transformed from a competent pilot into something approaching legend. The incident over the Black Sea remained classified, but whispers of it circulated through the fighter-pilot community like ghost stories told around campfires. An entire Russian formation, 6 Su-35, escorting a reconnaissance aircraft, had simply vanished from radar contact during what was supposed to be a routine intercept mission. Search and rescue teams from 3 countries had scoured thousands of square miles of open water, finding nothing but empty ocean and scattered debris that told no coherent story. The official report stated that weather conditions had contributed to a navigational error that resulted in the Russian aircraft exceeding their fuel reserves and being forced to ditch at sea. The unofficial version, shared only in secure briefing rooms and over drinks at officers' clubs where the walls were guaranteed to have no ears, painted a very different picture. Ghost had somehow managed to lead the entire enemy formation into a carefully orchestrated trap, using the terrain and weather conditions to mask her squadron's movements until it was far too late for the Russians to recover. When pressed for details, Ghost had simply stated that the enemy aircraft had experienced mechanical difficulties, and left it at that. Her squadron mates knew better than to push for more information, partly because they respected her privacy, but mostly because there was something in her eyes when she talked about that mission that suggested the full truth might be more disturbing than they were prepared to handle. The reassignment to Elmendorf had been presented as a promotion, a chance to share her expertise with a new generation of pilots and contribute to homeland defense operations. In reality, it was the military's way of putting one of their most effective weapons on a very short leash. Ghost understood the politics involved, but she also understood that skills like hers had a way of being needed when situations became desperate enough that protocol became negotiable. Standing in the briefing room, watching Reaper's barely concealed skepticism and the confused faces of pilots who had never seen real combat, Ghost felt a familiar sensation in her chest, the tightening that always preceded moments when the comfortable illusions of peacetime training were about to collide with the harsh mathematics of aerial warfare. The Russians hadn't sent bare bombers on a navigation exercise. They were probing, testing response times and procedures, looking for weaknesses in America's northern defenses. Colonel Martinez was still talking about weather patterns and communication protocols, but Ghost was already mentally flying the mission. She could see the intercept geometry in her mind, calculating distances and timing with the precision of a physicist working through a complex equation. The other pilots were thinking about this as a show of force, a chance to flex American military muscle for the cameras that would inevitably follow such encounters. Ghost knew better. This was the opening move of something much larger, and the Russians had chosen the Aleutian Islands for reasons that had nothing to do with navigation training and everything to do with the fact that they represented one of the most challenging flying environments on Earth. If someone wanted to test the limits of American air power, this was where they would do it. The briefing concluded with the usual reminders about rules of engagement and the importance of maintaining professional demeanor during what would certainly become an international incident regardless of how smoothly things went. As the other pilots filed out of the room, chattering about the mission and making predictions about how the Russians would respond to American intercept aircraft, Ghost remained in her seat, studying the weather reports with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan approached her with the casual confidence of someone who had never met an obstacle he couldn't charm or muscle his way through. "Hey, Ghost," he said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to be insulting without being overtly disrespectful. "I know you've been flying transports and trainers for a while now. If you want, I could take point on this one. Keep things simple until you get your combat legs back under you." Ghost looked up at him with eyes that had seen Russian fighters explode in balls of fire at distances where the enemy pilots never even knew they were being targeted. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no emotion whatsoever. "I appreciate the offer, Reaper, but I think I can manage." The way she said it made it clear that the conversation was over, and something in her expression suggested that continuing to push the issue might not be wise. Sullivan retreated with the graceless haste of someone who had just realized he was standing on much thinner ice than he'd initially thought. As he left the briefing room, Ghost heard him mutter something to one of the other pilots about administrative types and desk jockeys getting delusions of grandeur. She didn't react, because she had learned long ago that actions spoke with more authority than words ever could. The hangar smelled of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of high-performance machinery pushed to its operational limits. Ghost walked the pre-flight inspection of her assigned F-22 with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Every rivet, every surface, every system component received her complete attention. The aircraft, tail number 54098, was one of the newer Raptors, delivered to Elmendorf just 18 months earlier as part of the Pacific Theater Modernization Program. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, watched the inspection with professional interest. Santos had been working on fighter aircraft for 12 years, and she had developed an eye for pilots who understood their machines versus those who simply operated them. "She's been running clean, ma'am," Santos reported. "Fresh engines, all systems green. Loaded her out with full air-to-air configuration as specified." Ghost nodded, running her hand along the leading edge of the starboard wing. The composite materials felt smooth and cold beneath her gloves, but she could sense the power contained within the aircraft's sleek frame. Two Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines capable of pushing the Raptor beyond Mach 2, advanced radar systems that could track multiple targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, and weapons systems that could engage enemy aircraft before they even knew they were being hunted. "Fuel status?" Ghost asked, though she had already verified the information 3 times during her pre-flight checks. "Topped off plus external tanks rigged for jettison if needed," Santos replied. "Should give you about 2 hours of patrol time, longer if you're conservative with the afterburners." Ghost allowed herself a small smile. Santos clearly understood that this wasn't going to be a routine intercept mission, where fuel consumption followed predictable patterns. The sergeant had loaded the aircraft for extended operations, which suggested that either her experience with combat deployments had taught her to plan for complications, or Colonel Martinez had provided guidance that hadn't been included in the official briefing materials. The other 3 pilots were conducting their own pre-flight inspections, but Ghost noticed that their procedures lacked the obsessive attention to detail that had kept her alive during missions where the margin for error was measured in microseconds rather than minutes. Reaper, in particular, seemed more interested in discussing the mission with his crew chief than in personally verifying that every system was operating within acceptable parameters. At precisely 800 hours, the 4 F-22s began their taxi sequence toward the runway. Ghost's aircraft, designated Phantom 1, led the formation, followed by Reaper in Phantom 2, Lieutenant Sarah Chen in Phantom 3, and Captain Mike Rodriguez in Phantom 4. The morning sky was clear over Elmendorf, but weather reports indicated that conditions were deteriorating rapidly over their patrol area. As they waited for clearance from the control tower, Ghost keyed her radio to the squadron frequency. "Phantom Flight, this is Phantom 1. Comm check, report status." "Phantom 2, loud and clear. All systems green," came Reaper's response, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't handle through superior firepower and aggressive maneuvering. "Phantom 3, clear reception. Ready for takeoff," replied Chen, her tone crisp and professional. She was the newest member of the squadron, fresh from advanced combat training and eager to prove herself in operational conditions. "Phantom 4, copy all. Systems nominal," Rodriguez added. He was a veteran pilot with combat experience over Afghanistan and Iraq, but this was his first intercept mission in the unique environment of Alaskan airspace. The control tower granted takeoff clearance, and Ghost advanced her throttles to military power. The Raptor responded instantly, accelerating down the runway with the smooth urgency of a predator in pursuit of prey. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted into the morning sky with the effortless grace that had made the F-22 the most feared air superiority fighter in the world. As the formation climbed toward their patrol altitude, Ghost allowed herself to remember why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. Up here, above the complications and politics of ground-based existence, everything reduced to fundamental principles of physics and aerodynamics. Aircraft responded to control inputs with mathematical precision, weather patterns followed predictable laws, and success or failure depended entirely on skill, preparation, and the ability to make correct decisions under pressure. The Aleutian Islands stretched out below them like scattered emeralds in a sea of gunmetal gray. The weather was indeed deteriorating, with cloud formations building toward the west and visibility dropping as moisture-laden air masses collided with the cold currents flowing down from the Arctic Ocean. Ghost had flown in worse conditions, but she also knew that the Russians had chosen this particular weather pattern for good reasons. Phantom 1, this is Elmendorf Control. Be advised, radar contact with unknown aircraft bearing 270 degrees, range 120 miles. Estimated 4 contacts, altitude 30,000 feet, speed 450 knots. Ghost's voice remained perfectly calm as she acknowledged the transmission. Phantom 1 copies. 4 unknown contacts, bearing 270, 120 miles. Phantom flight, switch to combat frequency and prepare for intercept procedures. The transformation in the cockpit was immediate and complete. Systems that had been operating in training mode shifted into combat configuration. Radar signatures tightened as stealth systems engaged at maximum efficiency. Weapons systems went from standby to active status. Most importantly, Ghost felt her mind shift into the hyper-focused state that had allowed her to survive missions where lesser pilots had become statistics. Phantom flight, this is Phantom 1. Close formation, maintain Angels 30, speed 450. Weapons tight until further notice. Her instructions were delivered in the same tone she might have used to order coffee, but every pilot in the formation understood that they had just crossed the line from training exercise into operational reality. As they approached the intercept coordinates, Ghost's radar began painting a clearer picture of what they were facing. 4 aircraft in loose formation, definitely military from their flight characteristics, maintaining course and speed with the confidence of aircrew who knew exactly where they were going and weren't particularly concerned about American responses to their presence. The first visual contact came at 40 miles, massive shapes emerging from the cloud layer like whales breaching the surface of a gray ocean. Russian Tu-95 Bear bombers, their turboprop engines creating distinctive contrails in the cold air. These were not the sleek, modern aircraft that dominated contemporary air forces. They were flying anachronisms, designed in the 1950s, but still capable of delivering devastating payloads across intercontinental distances. But it was what Ghost saw escorting the bombers that made her blood pressure spike. Su-35 flanker fighters, their delta wings and powerful engines making them among the most capable air superiority aircraft in the Russian inventory. This wasn't a routine navigation exercise. This was a carefully planned probe designed to test American response capabilities and gather intelligence on F-22 performance characteristics. Phantom 1, this is Elmendorf Control. You are cleared to make visual contact and attempt radio communication with the unknown aircraft. Rules of engagement remain weapons tight unless directly threatened. Ghost acknowledged the transmission while her mind raced through tactical calculations. The Su-35s would be carrying long-range air-to-air missiles, probably R-37s capable of engaging targets at distances exceeding 100 miles. The Bears, while primarily bombers, could also be configured for maritime surveillance and electronic warfare. Most importantly, both aircraft types were equipped with modern radar systems that would be analyzing every aspect of F-22 performance during the intercept. Phantom flight, this is Phantom 1, approaching visual contact, maintain formation discipline and be ready for evasive maneuvers. Ghost's voice carried a subtle edge that caused every other pilot in the formation to double-check their systems and verify their positioning. As they closed to within 10 miles of the Russian formation, Ghost could see the details that intelligence briefings never quite captured. The Bears looked massive and ungainly, their 4 turboprop engines creating a sound that could be heard even through the closed cockpit of her F-22. But their crews were flying with the precision of professionals who had been practicing this exact scenario for months. The Su-35s were a different matter entirely. Sleek, modern, and obviously flown by pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities, they maintained perfect formation with the bombers while clearly scanning the airspace for threats. As Ghost watched, one of the flankers peeled away from the main formation and began a climbing turn that would position him for either an intercept or an attack run depending on how the next few minutes developed. Unknown Russian aircraft. This is United States Air Force Flight Phantom 1. You are approaching United States territorial airspace. State your intentions and alter course to avoid violation of sovereign boundaries. The response came in accented but clear English. American aircraft. This is Russian Air Force Flight Bear 17. We are conducting routine navigation training in international airspace. Our course and altitude are in full compliance with international aviation regulations. Ghost had heard similar transmissions dozens of times during previous intercept missions, but something about this one felt different. The Russian pilot's voice carried a confidence that suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about American fighters shadowing his formation. Either he was supremely confident in his aircraft's capabilities, or he knew something about the tactical situation that Ghost hadn't figured out yet. Bear 17. Be advised that your current course will result in violation of restricted airspace. Recommend immediate course correction to bearing 180 degrees. American aircraft, we will maintain current course and altitude. International law permits navigation in these waters. Ghost felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always preceded moments when diplomatic protocols gave way to more direct forms of communication. The Russian pilot was not going to alter course voluntarily, which meant that the intercept mission was about to become significantly more complicated. She keyed her radio to the squadron frequency. Phantom flight, close formation and prepare for escort procedures. Phantom 2, take high cover. Phantom 3 and 4, maintain current altitude and prepare to bracket the bomber formation. As her pilots maneuvered into position, Ghost found herself thinking about the intelligence briefings that had suggested Russian forces were becoming increasingly aggressive in their probing of American defenses. This encounter was clearly more than just a navigation exercise, and the presence of Su-35 escorts indicated that the Russians were prepared for the possibility of armed confrontation. The thought should have been disturbing, but Ghost found it oddly comforting. After 18 months of flying transport missions and training exercises, she was finally back in her element. The sky above the Aleutian Islands was about to become a three-dimensional chessboard where the pieces were multi-million-dollar fighter aircraft, and the stakes were measured in geopolitical consequences that would echo for decades. She adjusted her grip on the flight controls and settled deeper into her ejection seat. Captain Vera Ghost Kozlova was exactly where she belonged, and the Russians were about to discover why she had earned her call sign in the first place. The first indication that this wasn't going to be a standard intercept came when Ghost's radar warning receiver began painting signals from multiple directions. The The Su-35s weren't just escorting the bombers. They were conducting active radar searches designed to map American response patterns and gather intelligence on F-22 stealth characteristics. More concerning, the signal patterns suggested that there were additional Russian aircraft in the area that hadn't yet been detected by American radar systems. Phantom 1, this is Elmendorf Control. AWACS reports possible additional contacts bearing 090 degrees, range unknown, classification uncertain. Ghost's mind immediately began processing the tactical implications. If there were additional Russian aircraft approaching from the east, they could be attempting to set up a pincer movement designed to box in the American fighters. Alternatively, they might be positioned to conduct electronic warfare operations that would degrade American communications and radar capabilities at a critical moment. Phantom Flight, be advised of possible additional contacts from the east. Maintain situational awareness and report any radar contacts immediately. The formation continued its approach to the Russian bombers, but Ghost could feel the tension building in her cockpit. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, verifying that all defensive systems were operating at maximum effectiveness. The F-22's stealth capabilities would provide significant advantages in any engagement, but Russian pilots had been studying American tactics for decades and were likely prepared with countermeasures. As they closed to within 5 miles of the bomber formation, Ghost got her first clear visual of the Su-35 that had separated from the main group. The pilot was obviously experienced, maintaining a position that allowed him to monitor the American fighters while staying within supporting distance of the bombers. His aircraft appeared to be carrying a full air-to-air weapons load, and his maneuvering suggested that he was prepared to use them if the tactical situation deteriorated. Russian aircraft, this is Phantom 1. You are now within 50 miles of restricted airspace. This is your final warning to alter course. American pilot, came the response, and Ghost could hear the amusement in the Russian aviator's voice. Perhaps you are not aware that your government has been conducting similar flights near our territorial boundaries for many years. We are simply returning the courtesy. The diplomatic niceties were clearly over. Ghost made a decision that would have significant consequences for everyone involved in the encounter. Phantom Flight, this is Phantom 1. Execute Intercept Formation Alpha. Phantom 2, you have the Eastern Contact. Phantom 3 and 4, bracket the bomber formation. Weapons remain tight unless directly threatened. The transformation was immediate and stunning. 4 F-22 Raptors that had been flying in loose formation suddenly became a precisely coordinated hunting pack. Ghost's aircraft moved into close formation with the lead bomber, positioning herself where the Russian crew couldn't avoid seeing the advanced American fighter. Reaper climbed toward the Su-35 that had been shadowing from above, while Chen and Rodriguez moved to bracket the bomber formation from north and south. The message was clear and unmistakable. The United States Air Force was prepared to escalate this encounter to whatever level the Russians chose. The bombers could continue their course and accept American escort back to international waters, or they could attempt to push deeper into restricted airspace and face the consequences of that decision. For several long minutes, the two formations flew in tense proximity, while their respective governments undoubtedly engaged in heated diplomatic communications. Ghost could see the Russian bomber crew through their aircraft's windows, professional aviators who were clearly evaluating their options, just as carefully as she was evaluating hers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ghost's radar warning receiver suddenly began screaming alerts as multiple new contacts appeared on her scope, approaching from the northwest at high speed and low altitude. These weren't additional Russian aircraft. The radar signatures were completely wrong for any known Russian fighter or bomber type. Phantom 1, this is Elmendorf Control. We're showing multiple unknown contacts approaching your position from the northwest. Estimate 6 to 8 aircraft, low altitude, high speed. Classification unknown, but they appear to be military. Ghost felt ice forming in her stomach as she processed the implications. Unknown military aircraft approaching at low altitude meant stealth capabilities and hostile intent. No friendly forces were supposed to be operating in this area, which meant that what had started as a routine intercept mission had just become something much more dangerous. The Russian pilot's voice came over the radio frequency with a tone that had changed completely from its earlier amusement. American aircraft. We are also detecting unknown contacts approaching from the northwest. These are not Russian aircraft. In that moment, Ghost realized that both the American and Russian formations had stumbled into something that neither government had planned or expected. Somewhere in the vast airspace above the Aleutian Islands, unknown aircraft with stealth capabilities and hostile intentions were about to turn a tense diplomatic encounter into active combat. She keyed her radio to the emergency frequency that both American and Russian military forces monitored. All aircraft, this is United States Air Force Phantom 1. Unknown contacts approaching from northwest appear to have hostile intent. Recommend all aircraft take defensive positions immediately. The response from the Russian formation was immediate and professional. American aircraft, this is Bear 17. We concur with your assessment. Recommend coordinated defensive posture against unknown threat. Ghost had trained for many different scenarios during her career, but she had never imagined finding herself in a situation where American and Russian forces would need to coordinate their actions against a completely unknown adversary. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same aircraft that had been threatening each other moments before were now the only available assets capable of dealing with whatever was approaching from the northwest. Phantom Flight, this is Phantom 1. Unknown contacts are now designated as hostile, weapons free for self-defense only. Coordinate with Russian aircraft to establish defensive perimeter. As she spoke the words, Ghost realized that Captain Vera Kozlova was about to write a completely new chapter in the history of aerial combat. The young pilots who had been skeptical of her qualifications that morning were about to learn why the Air Force had kept her on active flight status, despite her reassignment to administrative duties. The sky above the Aleutian Islands was about to become a battlefield, and Ghost was exactly where she needed to be. The first visual contact with the unknown aircraft came at 20 miles, and what Ghost saw through her helmet-mounted display made her question everything she thought she knew about modern aviation technology. The contacts weren't showing up clearly on radar because they weren't conventional aircraft at all. They were something that defied easy classification, moving through the sky with flight characteristics that seemed to violate basic principles of aerodynamics. Phantom 1, do you have visual on the unknowns? Reaper's voice carried a tension that Ghost had never heard from him before. Affirmative, Phantom 2, I'm seeing. I'm not sure what I'm seeing. They don't look like any aircraft in our recognition manuals. The objects approaching from the northwest appeared to be triangular in shape, but their surfaces seemed to shift and change as they moved through the air. More disturbing, they were flying in formation with a precision that suggested either advanced automation or piloting skills that exceeded anything Ghost had encountered in her career. Their speed was inconsistent with their apparent size, and they seemed to be able to change direction without the banking and turning movements that conventional aircraft required. The Russian pilot's voice came over the emergency frequency with professional calm that barely concealed deep concern. American aircraft, we are observing flight characteristics that are not consistent with known technology. Recommend extreme caution in approach procedures. Ghost made a decision that would be analyzed and debated in military academies for decades afterward. All aircraft, this is Phantom 1, form defensive circle around bomber formation. Unknown contacts are exhibiting potentially hostile maneuvering, weapons free for self-defense if fired upon. The response was immediate and coordinated. 4 F-22 Raptors and 4 Russian aircraft formed a defensive perimeter around the Tu-95 bombers with a precision that would have been impossible without years of mutual respect between professional aviators. Political differences became irrelevant when faced with a common threat that neither side understood or could adequately assess. As the unknown aircraft closed to within 10 miles, Ghost threat warning systems began registering energy signatures that didn't match any known weapons systems. The contacts appeared to be scanning the combined American-Russian formation, with sensors that operated on frequencies and power levels that exceeded the parameters of conventional military radar. All aircraft, I'm reading active sensor scans from the unknowns. They appear to be conducting detailed analysis of our formations and capabilities. The first attack came without warning and from a direction that should have been impossible. One of the unknown aircraft, which had been approaching from the northwest, suddenly appeared directly above the defensive formation and began emitting some form of directed energy that caused immediate systems malfunctions across multiple aircraft. Ghost's cockpit lighting flickered, her radar display showed static interference, and her communication systems began producing feedback that made radio coordination nearly impossible. More critically, her flight controls became sluggish and unresponsive, as if the aircraft's fly-by-wire systems were being overwhelmed by external interference. All aircraft, I'm experiencing systems failures across multiple platforms. Unknown aircraft appear to be employing some form of electronic warfare capability. The Russian pilot's response confirmed that the effects weren't limited to American equipment. We are also experiencing significant systems degradation. Recommend immediate evasive maneuvers. But conventional evasive maneuvers proved to be inadequate against an adversary that didn't seem to be bound by conventional flight physics. The unknown aircraft moved through three-dimensional space with the fluidity of dolphins swimming through water, maintaining perfect formation coordination while simultaneously engaging multiple targets with weapon systems that produced no visible projectiles or missile signatures. Ghost found herself drawing on instincts and training that went deeper than formal military education. Her father's lessons about aerial combat during the height of the Cold War, her own experience over the Black Sea, and something indefinable that could only be called pilot intuition, combined to help her understand what was happening in the sky around her. The unknown aircraft weren't trying to destroy the American and Russian formations. They were studying them. Every maneuver, every defensive reaction, every weapons system activation was being recorded and analyzed by whatever intelligence lay behind those impossible flight characteristics. All aircraft, this is Phantom 1. I believe the unknowns are conducting reconnaissance rather than attempting destruction. Recommend coordinated withdrawal to international waters while maintaining defensive posture. The suggestion was tactically sound, but it required a level of trust between American and Russian forces that hadn't existed since the end of World War II. Ghost was asking pilots who had been trained to view each other as potential enemies to coordinate their movements while under attack from an adversary that neither side understood. The response came from the Russian formation leader, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. American aircraft, we concur with your assessment. Recommend combined withdrawal bearing 180 degrees, maintain formation integrity. What followed was a masterpiece of aerial coordination that would be studied in military academies for generations. 8 military aircraft from 2 different nations, flying completely different aircraft types with incompatible communication systems, executed a fighting withdrawal while under constant harassment from unknown adversaries, whose capabilities exceeded anything in their tactical manuals. Ghost found herself serving as the coordinator for the entire operation, her voice providing guidance and instruction to pilots who had been strangers an hour earlier and were now dependent on her leadership for their survival. The young woman who had been dismissed as a desk jockey that morning was now commanding the most complex aerial operation in the history of modern aviation. Phantom 2, adjust bearing 2 degrees starboard and maintain close escort on the lead bomber. Russian fighters, recommend you bracket formation north and south while maintaining defensive search patterns. The unknown aircraft continued their harassment throughout the withdrawal, but their attacks seemed designed to test reactions rather than inflict damage. Systems failures were temporary, communications disruption followed predictable patterns, and weapons lock-ons were broken before missiles could be launched. As the combined formation reached international waters, the unknown aircraft simply vanished. One moment they were maintaining close formation with the retreating American and Russian aircraft. The next moment they had disappeared completely from both visual and radar contact. No gradual departure, no visible maneuvering. They simply ceased to exist in the same airspace. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the electronic warfare attacks had been. Ghost found herself flying in formation with Russian aircraft, while both sides tried to process what had just occurred. The diplomatic implications were staggering, but the technological implications were potentially civilization-changing. American aircraft, this is Bear 17. We recommend immediate contact with our respective commands to report this encounter. Whatever we just experienced, it was not of terrestrial origin. Ghost had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it stated explicitly by the Russian pilot made the reality more concrete and more disturbing. They had just encountered technology that exceeded human capabilities by margins that couldn't be explained through conventional aerospace development. Bear 17, this is Phantom 1. Concur with your assessment. Recommend all aircraft return to base for immediate debriefing. This incident requires highest priority classification. As the Russian and American formations separated to return to their respective bases, Ghost found herself thinking about the young pilots in her flight who had just experienced something that would change their understanding of human technology and humanity's place in the universe. They had started the morning as part of a routine intercept mission, and were returning home having participated in the most significant encounter between human and non-human intelligence in recorded history. The approach to Elmendorf Air Force Base was conducted in complete radio silence, with each pilot lost in private contemplation of what they had witnessed. Ghost's aircraft touched down on runway 06 with the same precision she had demonstrated thousands of times before, but everything about the world had changed during the 3 hours they had been airborne. As the formation taxied toward the secure hangar area, Ghost could see vehicles and personnel already positioning themselves for what would certainly be the most comprehensive debriefing in Air Force history. Intelligence officers, technical specialists, and senior commanders who had been summoned from across the Pacific Theater were gathering to hear first-hand accounts of an encounter that would redefine human understanding of technology and the universe. Captain Vera Ghost Kozlova shut down her engines and began the post-flight checklist that she had performed thousands of times before, but she knew that this was the last time she would complete these procedures as simply another Air Force pilot. Whatever happened next, however the military and government chose to respond to what they had experienced, Ghost understood that her life and career had just taken a turn that no amount of training or preparation could have anticipated. The young pilots who had questioned her qualifications that morning were now looking at her with expressions that combined respect, confusion, and something approaching awe. They had witnessed her coordination of the most complex aerial operation in modern history, and they had seen her make decisions under pressure that had likely prevented an international incident from escalating into something far more serious. As she climbed out of her cockpit, Ghost caught sight of her reflection in the aircraft's canopy. The woman looking back at her was still Captain Vera Kozlova, still the daughter of a Ukrainian immigrant and a Montana rancher, still the pilot who had learned to fly in crop dusters before she was old enough to drive. But she was also something new, the first human military commander to successfully coordinate joint operations with a foreign power against a non-terrestrial adversary. The implications of that distinction would echo through her life and career in ways that she was only beginning to understand. Colonel Martinez approached her aircraft with an expression that combined relief, concern, and barely controlled excitement. Behind him, Ghost could see intelligence officers and technical specialists who were already preparing for debriefing sessions that would likely continue for weeks or months. "Captain Kozlova," Martinez said as she completed her post-flight inspection, "I need you to understand that everything that happened during this mission is now classified at levels that require special clearance just to discuss. You and your flight crew are restricted to base until further notice, and you'll be meeting with intelligence specialists who have been cleared to handle encounters of this nature." Ghost nodded, unsurprised by the security measures but curious about the implication that the Air Force had protocols for handling encounters of this